Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Heathcliff, but everyone only ever knows me as Heath. I was raised in the French quarter of downtown Charleston and grew up here as my family genealogy dates back to the French Huguenots that immigrated here in 1680 and initially settled down in the area. I would describe this French quarter as a small neighbourhood in the southeastern corner of the peninsula. It's known for its cobbled streets, cute little alleyways and old-world charm. You really feel like you're going back in time when you walk down some of those streets here. I love the fact that everything is so centrally located, close to loads of art galleries, great restaurants and quirky cafes, and of course the best pastries that you've ever tasted. But then, this is the French Quarter, so you wouldn't expect anything less. Growing up, my eclectic, very avant-garde mother worked in an art gallery here and was very involved with up-and-coming artists, while my fastidious, hard-working father was involved in the thriving, colourful world of real estate. Ironically, my brother and I never shared our parents' passionate interests in the arts or in real estate. Not that we don't appreciate their intrinsic value, of course. It was just my brother and I were intrepid adventure seekers and outdoor enthusiasts and would spend all our free time camping, hiking and exploring. The story I'm about to share with you happened to my brother and I when we were in our early 20s in about 2008. We were very fortunate and privileged that my father's brother Peter owned his own small hunting estate in West Virginia, which wasn't far away from Charleston. We were always invited to stay up there whenever we fancied some fresh air, exercise and adventure. We could arrive at my uncle's farmhouse unannounced at any time we liked, as there were no formalities with our family. There was always so much to do on my uncle's shooting ranch, even when it was not hunting season. Sometimes we would enjoy a spot of hiking, camping or even fishing in his large lake, so for two rambunctious, over-enthusiastic, assiduous teenagers, the world was our oyster. My uncle's ranch was very beguiling, as he lived in an old-fashioned 1700s colonial farmhouse that epitomised its historic roots, with the typical influences from the time, such as a quintessential brick facade, and perfectly aligned windows with a central front door. The idyllic, enchanting farmhouse was surrounded by rich carpets of verdant turf, wooden poled fences, quaint little barns, rolling hills, mountainous valleys, ponds, a creek, a silvery lake, and a vast area of wood green filled with all kinds of indigenous wildlife, including a thriving whitetail population. Over the years, as young boys, my brother and I had observed some inexplicable, freakish things going on in those woods that were an enigma to us and rather nonsensical. On many occasions we would discern rocks piled up on top of each other in bizarre, unnatural piles, with the largest rock at the bottom and the smallest at the top. It seemed both puzzling and perplexing to us, as these curious patterns of rocks were distributed throughout the woods, and looked like some internal kind of messaging system, but by who or what we could not even imagine. We would always see young saplings in the forest twisted over deliberately, and then there were broken pieces of timber hanging up high in the treetops, like ominous, inauspicious Christmas decorations done in horizontal crosses, as if to say, "Keep out!" It really left you with a real sense of foreboding and impending doom that left us ever so slightly unsettled and discomposed. My brother and I concluded that some kids who'd been watching the Blair Witch Project had decided to terrify all the hunters by displaying all this creepy-looking regalia around the woods. That's what we thought had happened. In hindsight, it might have been something we would have done when we were much younger to creep somebody out. If we'd thought about it, of course, but we never were that imaginative. It would have been a great Halloween trick, come to think about it. Despite these strange, rather peculiar anomalies, Woody and I were both level-headed, pragmatic and circumspect, so we thought nothing more about it. On this occasion we were scouting the woods for our early morning hunt the following day, because the best time to take down a good buck is between 8 and 9 in the morning, as the rest of the day they tend to lay low in the thicket for cover. The deer prefer to venture out early morning and evening, and so these are the best times to hunt. But most hunters report greater successes in the morning, which makes a great deal of sense to me. Despite the fact that my uncle has methodically planted some fixed deer stands on the estate that are accessible to hunters as hideouts, which are intentionally located in strategic points that are close to salt licks, deer feeding stations and water sources, my brother and I have our very own ideas of what actually works for us as aspiring hunters. In my acumen, with practice, intuitiveness, prudence and refinement, you begin to sense what actually works for you on a personal level as a hunter. We also have our own individual idiosyncrasies about what it inevitably takes to advance and sharpen your skills in becoming the quintessential accomplished hunters you are desirous to become, with a great deal of dedication, time and hard work, of course. My brother and I infinitely prefer to hunt from a blind, as when we're head-to-head after a buck, I find it a whole lot easier getting down to his level to shoot at. The sumptuous wood green on my uncle's land is spread out over a fair distance and separated by mountainous ridges and ravines. I found in the past that the white-tailed deer like to bed on the upper third of the slope against the wind, so they can observe any oncoming danger. I think they like the shelter and security of the walled enclosure of the ridge, and the very fact that it's covered with dense thicket. It's great for hiding in. Judging by the trails of deer scat, it looked like this is exactly what the deer were doing, and I was proved right. My brother and I stood on the opposite ridge that overlooked the mountainous slope, scanning and glassing the whole area through our binoculars, and sure enough, as we had rightly predicted, we could see the bobbing outlines of some hefty-looking whitetail lying low in the high grass on a raised elevation a third of the way up in this densely thick mountainous ravine. My brother and I then followed the freshest scat and the areas where the deer had been eating until we found the perfect place to set up our blinds. This was between some bushy thicket and a couple of trees. We returned to my uncle's home later and spent the rest of the evening enjoying dinner with his family and my two younger cousins, Boris and Brett, who are still only youngsters, about 10 and 9 years of age. My Uncle Peter is a very quirky, eccentric character, and when I mentioned to him that his woods looked like something out of the Blair Witch Project, he laughed and said, "You've got that right, son. It's creepy in those woods." My uncle informed me that he had some hunters refusing to hunt on the land after seeing such strange anomalies displayed around the wood green. They were freaked out, he told me. It sent chills down their spines. "It's possibly just kids having a laugh," I said, "trying to scare everybody." "Exactly my thought," said my uncle. "My kids have their 10-year-old friends to play in the woods all the time. Who knows what that lot get up to in there?" "We don't put up those funny crosses, Daddy," protested Boris. "We don't do things like that." "Well, if your friends didn't do it," reflected my uncle, "it could have been a deliberate act by a poacher trying to scare off other hunters, because I've been having big issues with poachers lately. They access our property by the rear side, so they can't be seen. It's becoming a continuous problem for me." "Well, that would make sense too," I said. "I mean, a poacher deliberately trying to scare off hunters, that could happen." My uncle continued, "One of the hunters was convinced there was a Bigfoot loitering around the place. Believe me, if there was a creature like that around here, I'd be the first to know about it. I've lived on this hunting ranch for 20 long years, and I've never seen anything like that. If my hunting clients had seen anything out of the ordinary, I'm sure they would have told me." "Not necessarily," said Woody. I've heard that if people see a Bigfoot, they shut up because they're terrified of ridicule. Bigfoot, I reflected. Now that creature isn't real, right? Of course it's not, son, chuckled my uncle. It's a bunch of baloney, invented by television producers to increase their ratings because people love mystery, and a subject like Bigfoot is bound to get people talking. It's just fictitious, that's all. But there's no real substance to any of those rumours, I assure you of that. Exactly right, said Woody. There are no dead bodies ever found of Bigfoot. No DNA evidence for that matter. It's as legendary as the Loch Ness Monster is in Scotland. I'm sure of that. After a long evening spent with my uncle, full of fun and laughter, we retired to bed early. It was very dark when my brother and I finally rose out of our beds. I've never ever been an early bird, so getting up at the crack of dawn was exceedingly difficult for me. I quickly drank a large mug of coffee, hoping that the caffeine would finally wake me up. Before long, my brother and I made our way to the deer blind and sprayed our camouflage gear down with a spray that we've been using for many years. It's brilliant for eliminating human odours. I then sprinkled the area with some deer corn and placed some peanut butter in strategic points, as in my experience, deers love peanut butter. It was an exquisitely beautiful night. There was a full ivory moon that illuminated the dusky firmament, and there was a twinkling of silvery stars that sparkled from the sky. I could still hear the sounds of crickets and frogs as the rejuvenating cool breeze blew gently against my face. I was beginning to wake up. Before long, my brother and I were seated in our deer stands on two of our very comfortable portable chairs, designed especially for the blind. No expense had been spared in this purchase, as my brother and I believed in the significance of being ultra-comfy in your blind, as the last thing you want is to be uncomfortable, especially if you're waiting for a sizable buck to arrive on the scene. It could render you stiff and tight, which ultimately would affect your shoot. Sometimes the waiting can be very long, monotonous and dreary, and so forbearance and stoicism are very much called into play without question, and a good hunter is an extremely patient man, and I've learnt that the very hard way. In a trice it would seem as if the night folded away as the early shafts of sunlight illuminated the sylvan in a pretty light, and very suddenly the sounds of warbles and twitters permeated across the valley, and a new day was finally born. I could feel my heart twitching and fluttering in excitement, because I was anticipating a very good hunt, and I sensed in my gut that this was going to be a day to remember. Little did I know how right I was, but it would be a day I would never forget, for reasons that would leave me baffled in the years to come. On this particular hunt I was using a Rugger 2 Varminter K1B BBZ, which had proved a winner to me personally. At about 8:30 I could hear the sound of a blue jay making a raucous commotion, which often does mean that deers are coming into the vicinity. All of a sudden I could hear the deer scampering towards the trail of food that we'd laid out very generously. The deer were unusually calm and complacent, and not skittish at all. It was clear they were oblivious to our presence, and standing there in a perfect line of fire was a very sizable bull with an impressive rack, and so I steadied my rifle and aimed at his brains, and he was down like a light, and it was over so fast. I think the other deer couldn't even comprehend what had happened, but they all scattered away like greased lightning. "I've got him," I said to my brother, looking thrilled, and we high-fived each other with delight. "Well done, Heath. That was one hell of a shot," said my brother. "I've never taken a deer down like this before, as this critter died on impact, and that has got to be the most humane kill ever." I waited for a moment, and then to my absolute amazement, walking through the brush towards my deer were two men in camouflage suits with rifles in their hands, and they looked rugged, unkempt, and rough around the edges. I knew at once that they were poachers, and their intentions were not good. "What the hell?" I said to my brother as I watched in horror as a strapping-look, thuggish man began dragging the buck I'd killed along the ground, as if it was his trophy. "What a hell of a cheek! What on earth did he think he was actually doing?" I thought in disgust. I immediately climbed out of my blind and protested. "Excuse me, but that's my deer. What the heck do you think you're doing?" "I think you'll find that it's our deer," he said in a cursory voice. I've been stalking this deer for days now. It's mine. I've had my eyes on it for a very long time, long before you even got here." "I think you're missing the point," I insisted. "It's my deer. I shot it." "Who gives a damn whether you shot it or not?" said the man. "I told you, it's mine," he growled. I was about to argue when his friend began to point the rifle at us and said, "If you mess with us, you're both dead. Do you understand? And I mean it." "Fine," I said. "You take the deer if it means that much to you. But just stop pointing that rifle at us, will you?" We watched the oafish men leave the area, one dragging the deer along the ground by the antlers and the other guarding the deer by walking backwards with the rifle pointed directly at us. I've never seen anything so pathetic in all my life, as those men were literally holding us up for a deer. It was utterly ridiculous and nonsensical. I felt incensed. Who the hell did they think they were, treating us in such a hostile, despicable manner? "Did you see that?" I said to my brother. "Wait until Uncle Pete hears about this. Those men need to be arrested. And as for stealing our trophy, I've seen everything now. That's crazy." My brother looked exceedingly perturbed. "I can't believe they had the bold-faced brass neck to steal our deer like that, and then to actually threaten us like that. It's insane. It's a deer, for goodness sake, not a cargo of gold bullion." Suddenly we heard one of the poachers screaming, "Shoot! Shoot! Go on, shoot!" "What the heck are those men doing now?" I asked my brother. Woody and I raced towards the noise to see what the commotion was all about. Were these poachers killing another deer? Nothing would surprise me at all. They had no code of ethics whatsoever. They had taken my deer illegally, and they were now poaching another one unlawfully. "It's over there," said one poacher, "in the woods behind the tree. It's a big bear too. We must take him down now. I've always wanted to kill a bear. Now's our chance." "You're crazy," said his friend. "We can't take a bear on with our rifles. Let's get out of here. We've got what we came for." The other man didn't listen and obstinately began firing his rifle towards the dark silhouette of the bear that suddenly came bounding out of the shadows, thundering towards the two men like a rhino in the thicket. And this bear moved with incredible speed, like that of a cheetah, but the ground vibrated and heaved under its massive weight. The two men were so shocked that their fingers were trembling violently, and they began to run away as quickly as they possibly could. But they were no match for the savage bear, who was determined to extract his ultimate revenge, and he was not packing any punches either. He was clearly incensed that one of the poachers had tried to kill him, and he was not about to let them off lightly. Not a chance in heaven. In the twinkling of an eye, the rampaging, ferocious bear lunged towards the poacher, grabbing him ruthlessly by his arms and throttling him on the ground, beating his skull so violently against a rocky outcrop, until finally it broke open like a large ostrich egg, with bits of brain and scalp lying spilt all over the ground, like the most macabre, horrifying scene that you've ever witnessed. I even think Universal Studios would have paid big bucks to film such an explicit, grievous, and most appalling scene. I had never witnessed such a speedy, vicious, barbaric, and savage death before. The other man began to run away as fast as he possibly could, with eyes as round as saucers. I could see that in his terror he had wet his pants. Surprisingly, the pugnacious bear did not actually chase after him, possibly because he had not been one of the shooters, and had singled out the man who had fired at him for the frenzied attack. In revenge, I imagine. I stood there in horror. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I was so incapacitated by terrible fear. I was barely able to move a muscle, and I just stood there suspended in a state of incredulous disbelief and repudiation. The critter turned around to face in our direction, and I realised to my horror that this was no bear. It was a humanoid ape, and then it hit me like a bolt of lightning, blasting through my mind with a powerful force. Of course, this was a Bigfoot. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. Bigfoot was real. He wasn't a creature of fiction after all. This Bigfoot was bigger than a grizzly bear, and clearly bipedal, with very powerful tree-trunk-sized legs and overlong arms with substantial biceps. It had the most phenomenal-sized shoulders that I've ever seen, with a stomach like a flashboard that was solid muscle. It towered at about 8 feet tall, 600 to 700 pounds, and about 3 foot in width. Its streamlined muscular body was covered in light golden hair, very similar in colour to a grizzly bear, and easily as thick. The creature's dome-shaped head literally merged into its shoulders in a seamless flow, and there was no evidence of a neck to speak of. The hairless grey leathery face was very broad, with a very prominent square jawline and pronounced brow ridge that was deeply furrowed with wrinkles. It possessed the flattest nose that I've ever seen, thin lips and very deep-set eyes. I noticed that he wore a deep scar on the edges of his mouth that curled down towards his upper shoulder, and no hair grew in that region, so it was exceedingly distinguishable, rather like a tattoo. It was a war wound of some kind, I should imagine. The critter kicked the dead corpse very angrily, making some very annoyed grunting sounds. I could tell he was livid that someone had tried to shoot at him. It was an offence to him. Suddenly I let out the most noisy sneeze or hachoo, and to my horror the Bigfoot quickly glided over to where my brother and I were standing. I'm not ashamed to admit it, that I began to shake like a jelly, as I've never been so terrified by anything in my entire life. This creature was an apex predator, and my rifle felt like a pathetic water pistol in my hands, or a kid's toy. I was almost certain that my brother and I were dead. The Bigfoot stood there staring at us, and we immediately dropped our rifles to the ground because we knew we were no match for the critter, and we knew that challenging him would make him as mad as hell, and we didn't stand a chance against him. When he looked at us for a moment, I noticed that he had very intelligent, discerning eyes. He was not a stupid creature by any manner of means, and was capable of very deep thought and reflection. The critter looked at me with a rather amused expression on his face, and then he did the weirdest thing you could ever imagine. He tried to imitate my large sneeze, so I made another one. Achoo! He looked at me and imitated my sneeze again and again, and I nodded to encourage him, and he did it again. He copied the sneeze and seemed very pleased with the sound, and he walked away from us practising the sneeze all the while, and then finally he was gone from our sight, with his brand new noise in tow, I should imagine. We were exceedingly lucky to be able to retrieve our deer that the poachers stole from us. The police were alerted to the dead body of the poacher on my uncle's ranch. My brother and I told our amazed uncle that it was a Bigfoot that had actually killed the poacher. I was to learn that Uncle Peter had actually told the police that it was a bear that had attacked the man. He said that if he'd told them the truth, he doubted they would have believed his story. The police did go searching for the aggressive bear, but they couldn't find him anywhere. I actually heard one officer say to his friend, "That must have been some bear to kill in such a savage way. Bears don't kill like this in my experience." "If indeed it was a bear," said the other officer. My uncle still lives on his shooting ranch to this very day, and the signs are very clear that the Bigfoot is still around. My uncle actually had a chance encounter with him on one occasion a few years ago, when he saw the Bigfoot in the woods on a hunt. He said the creature looked directly at him with large twinkling brown eyes, and although my uncle was absolutely terrified by him because of his intimidating appearance, he sensed almost immediately that the creature wasn't in the least bit hostile and meant him absolutely no harm. I think he encountered the very same Bigfoot that Woody and I discerned, as the critter had that telltale scar around his mouth and upper chest. My uncle believes the poacher was killed because he wanted to kill the Bigfoot. He mistook it for a bear, so he warns everybody about what happened and says, "Don't you ever take on the Bigfoot on my land, nor try to kill it, because it will kill you in a heartbeat if you try to attack it. If you respect him, he will respect you and leave you well alone, as it means you no harm. But if you challenge him, you are almost certainly dead." So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Grayson, although my name is often just shortened to Gray. And I'm from the Pacific Northwest, which for those of you who do not know is often called Cascade, and is geographically located in North America, bounded by the Pacific Ocean to the west and the Rocky Mountains to the east. My strange and curious story that ultimately led to my Bigfoot encounter happened in the 80s, but the exact date of the event has long since been forgotten, given it was a long time ago. But the indelible effects of the haunting encounter are forever imprinted on my mind, with such a startling clarity, so much so that it would seem that the events could have happened yesterday, as the intrinsic details of my recall is nothing short of astonishing, and even if I say so myself, this is one hell of a story that will quite literally knock your socks off. Indeed, the story is so incredulous and seemingly far-fetched that even I scratch my head in deep contemplation at times and say to myself, did that really happen? Yet I assure you that with the same certainty we know that the sky is blue and the grass is green. That is how assured I am that this story did indeed happen to me. I grew up here in the Pacific Northwest with my younger brother Kingston and my mother and dad, and in those days the Pacific Northwest was even more wild and densely forested than it is today. Some of the largest, most gigantic, beautiful trees in the entire world can be found here, and this is unequivocally due to the cool, wet climate, which is so perfect for coastal and temperate rainforests, while the inland areas are much drier and warmer. So environmentally speaking, it's hardly a wonder that the Pacific Northwest hosts some of the world's most phenomenal trees. I grew up in an attractive rural provincial neighbourhood with the colourful ranch-style houses reminiscent of the 80s, which were spaced generously apart with very decent-sized front and back yards. In those days, the main gravel dusty road in our neighbourhood was not tarmacked and was quite rustical and pastoral, and the nearest town was at least 20 minutes away. As is often the case in every countrified community, everybody knew each other, and people were companionable, congenial and affable, and many of the locals regularly socialised together, with plenty of dancing, barbecues and parties, and those were wildly social and wonderful times. At the time, my down-to-earth, pragmatic, rather practical mother was a stay-at-home mother. She took care of us while our dad worked in the local town. Growing up as kids, my brother Kingston and I would spend copious amounts of time in the wood green that flanked the rear of the neighbourhood properties. It was a sumptuous area of national forest, or publicly owned land if you like, that was open and accessible to the public, and consisted of clear hiking trails for ramblers, dog walkers and runners. We were exceedingly fortunate that the backyards of our homes faced the enchanting, densely pocketed area of woodland, and although fenced in, some people actually had their own gates that led into the sylvan for their convenience and easy accessibility. People just loved opening their gates into the woods and taking their dogs for a walk in the shaded retreat, with all the animal smells and fresh deer scat. Those dogs were in an olfactory heaven. My brother and I made a hole in our fence so that we could squeeze through it and go playing in the wood green whenever we had a chance. For us as young boys, the shaded sanctuary was the most exciting playground, full of majestic, imposing trees with the most gargantuan trunks that towered up into the sky like statuesque, imposing giants. And they ranged from oaks to Douglas firs and red elders, and they were so regal and magnificent. Kingston and I would just marvel at them, and we would hug the tree trunks because we loved to run our hands down the velvety smooth moss that carpeted the trunks, or even feel the textured bark beneath our fingertips. The forest floor consisted of cleared pathways and was veiled with pretty lacy green ferns. This stunning oasis was teeming with indigenous wildlife, such as deer, squirrels, raccoons, coyotes, snowy owls, and sometimes even bears. And from time to time I'd even observed golden eagles soaring in the skies with their wide outstretched wings and their piercing eyes scanning the ground below, searching for a meal on the move. My story begins when I was about 12 years old and has a great deal to do with our next-door neighbour, Mrs. Julia Macy, who was one of my mother's greatest, most beloved friends. I loved Julia, as she was a wholesome, unpretentious, very genuine, warm-hearted person with an outgoing, gregarious personality. Julia Macy had 2 toddlers, and they lived next door to us. She was married to a very reserved, demure and guarded man called Niles, who seemed like a pretty decent fellow to me, although he barely ever said boo to a goose, because he was so self-contained, private and uncommunicative. One day Julia Macy was telling my mother that her father had died tragically of a heart attack, and her presumptuous, officious mother had literally insisted on moving in with their entire family. What else could I do, she told my mother. I tried to encourage Mother to go and live in a retirement home, but she refuses to go, and has insisted upon moving in with us. I wouldn't mind, of course, but the problem is my mother absolutely despises Niles. She makes no secret of her contempt and abhorrent loathing she feels towards him. My house has quite literally become a war zone because I can feel my mother's malicious animosity towards my husband. She looks at him all the time like a deranged savage cat that would like to lash out at him with her sharp claws and devour him like a mouse, leaving only his tail behind. Yesterday she made him a cup of hot coffee and accidentally spilt it on his lap. She looked so satisfied with herself, and she had that smug look on her face when my husband got burnt. I know she did it on purpose. Now that's nasty, said my mother. Actually, it's positively vindictive. That's my contemptible mother for you. Niles describes her as the mother-in-law from hell and has literally begged me to make her leave the house before he throttles her or does something mad. Surely you could get her to leave, said my mother. You should not have your mother coming between your marriage like this. It's really not healthy for your family, given how much ill will your mother harbours towards Niles. I'm afraid it gets worse, said Julia, sighing. Niles suffers from asthma and is highly allergic. But what does my mother do? She brings her grandchildren the fluffiest, cutest cat that you can ever imagine. Of course, the kids are absolutely delighted, but Niles is sneezing all over the place. I have not got the heart to remove the cat from the kids, because they'll think I'm a monster if I do such a thing. And they're so smitten with the cat. The only contention I have is that Niles is suffering really badly with the most dreadful allergies and sneezing fits. Of course she did this on purpose to upset him, and she's succeeding. And what's more, she's enjoying herself way too much. We could keep the cat for you, suggested my mother, and your kids could come and visit her whenever they like, and that way Niles would not have all those horrible allergies. Oh, that would be wonderful if you could do that, said Julia. That would really help a lot. I haven't actually told you the worst of it. You're going to be shocked when I tell you what happened next. You mean there's more? Said my mother, looking aghast. Oh, yes, there's much more, I'm afraid. It actually happened on Tuesday night when I came home. My frantic mother was bustling around the kitchen, preparing the most sumptuous feast for the whole family. Oh, the smells were so delicious. She was cooking up a storm. There was roast pork crackling and all the trimmings. For a moment I actually thought she'd turned over a new leaf and was contributing to helping around the house, but I couldn't have been more deceived and misled. No, she had much more nefarious, iniquitous motives under that sleeve of hers. Go on, said my mother. You've got me intrigued. Well, remember that one man I dated many years ago? Oh, you mean Robert Miller? That's right, him. Well, it turns out he recently got divorced, so my mother actually invited him around to dinner, and she had the nerve to arrange a romantic rendezvous with my ex by inviting him over to the house. My mother gasped. You've got to be joking. No, I'm not. My mother kept going on about what a great couple Robert and I had made in front of Niles. That's how shamefully depraved, rude and obnoxious she was. Now that is churlish and downright obnoxious, said my mother, looking absolutely appalled. You must have been livid. Oh, I was, believe me. Poor Niles, he just retreated back to our bedroom while we continued to entertain Robert all night. My mother had the audacity to actually tell Robert that Niles and I were getting divorced. Can you imagine when I told him that we weren't? He looked so disappointed. I told him that Mum was just barking up the wrong tree, because I think he was hoping to rekindle the old flame. I could have killed Mother for upsetting Niles like this. She's a meddling, interfering old busybody, determined to get her own way at any cost. I don't understand, said my mother. Why does she despise Niles so much? I think she's always felt he wasn't good enough for me. My mother's always been a bit of an inverted snob, pretentious and conceited, with a misplaced sense of superiority. I truly think she considers our family as upper middle class, bordering on royalty. She's always possessed very rigid, fixed ideas of who I should marry. Unfortunately, Niles is powerless to fit her irreproachable mould. She literally wanted me to marry a lawyer, a surgeon, a magistrate, a doctor. Who knows? But Niles, being a plumber, just didn't tick the right boxes for her. When I got married to Niles, she visited him the night before our wedding day with a chequebook in hand. offering him over $50,000 to call our wedding off. She did what? Gasped my mother. Are you joking? That's disgusting. Oh, yes, she did. And when Niles refused to be bribed by my mother, she offered him $100,000, but he still refused, and then she stormed off in a huff. I remember when I listened to this conversation with my mother and her friend, I was horrified. I decided that Julia Macy's mother must be a very nasty, vindictive piece of work, and that was definitely confirmed when she visited our family for a barbecue with Niles, Julia, and her two rambunctious toddlers. Julia's mother was an emaciated, pale, mousy-looking woman who was opinionated, feisty, and hot-headed. When she sat down at the table, she kept eyeing her son-in-law with the look of a vulture wanting to pounce upon her prey and tear it limb from limb. It was really awkward sitting at the table as a family hosting our guests, as we could feel the obvious tension and discord between Julia's mother and Niles, which made things ever so slightly awkward and uncomfortable. "Should Niles be eating that?" she chided, pointing to Niles' cornbread on his plate. "It might make you fat, Niles. I've been noticing those extra inches creeping upon your belly lately. I know Julia likes her men very slim." "Mum, Niles can eat exactly what he likes," scolded Julia. "I'd love him even if he was a hippo." "No, you wouldn't, Julia. You know that's not true," she snapped. Julia's mother began asking my father all about his job and what degrees he had behind him, and the next thing we were hearing all about how inadequate Niles was. "You've done very well for yourself, young lady," Julia's mother told my mum. "I'm so impressed. I only wish Julia here was as discerning as you when it comes to men. She should take a leaf from your book." "Enough, mother," snapped Julia. "I've had about as much as I can take of your shenanigans. For goodness sake, shut up and stop putting Niles down, or else I'll take you to that retirement village myself, even if you're kicking and screaming." I'm glad to say that Julia's cutting words did the trick, and finally her mother did shut up, although you could tell there was a lot more she would have liked to have said, but I could see that she was biting her lip very hard. After dinner was over and the Macys had finally returned home, my mother said, "What an awful woman! She is the quintessential mother-in-law from hell, if ever I saw one." Fast forward a week or so and Kingston woke me up during the night. He was shaking me violently. "Get up! Get up!" "What is it?" I said, groaning, wiping away the sleep from my eyes. "What's up?" "There's something out there in the backyard," said Kingston earnestly. "It was making strange whooping sounds. So I looked out of the window, and then I saw it. The critter, it was making this weird sound, and it jumped over the fence. It looked like a bear, but it wasn't a bear. It looked like a human, but it wasn't a human. I've no idea what it was, but it was scary, and it looked like a ghost." "Are you sure about this?" I asked, looking very perturbed. "Of course I'm sure," said my brother, looking at me with wide, earnest eyes. "I wouldn't wake you up for nothing. I know what I saw." I became very excited because I had a friend at school who'd also seen a rather big creature that looked like a bear, but it wasn't a bear, that had crossed his path so fast that he'd barely been able to see whatever it was. The critter had left these huge footprints behind in the ground that were 22 inches long, and his father had said that they were definitely not bear prints because they had very discernible toes, and bears don't have toes. Ever since then, I had pondered and marvelled at what my friend had seen, and maybe I was about to find out now, because listening to what Kingston was telling me, this critter could be the very same creature that my friend had observed. "Come," I said impulsively, "we're going to see exactly what it is." "Are you sure that's a good idea?" said my brother. "What if the thing is dangerous? What if it actually hurts us?" "You want to miss out on an adventure of a lifetime, Kingston," I scolded. "Not a chance in hell. We've got to go and see what it is. Imagine what the kids at school will have to say when we tell them we saw a real live monster." "We can take a baseball bat with us for self-defence," I suggested, and I'm glad to say my brother seemed appeased by the idea. So armed with flashlights, we tiptoed into the heart of the forest with great stealth, making absolutely certain to be as quiet as we possibly could, hiding behind trees and keeping in the dark shadows to ensure that nothing would discern us as we moved ever forwards into the sylvan. Luckily it was a bright full moon, which made visibility for us excellent. Imagine our amazement when we could hear digging sounds in the woods, and I heard Julia Macy's very distinctive musical voice. "Oh my God! I can't believe this has happened. It was an accident, a dreadful accident. I just pushed her ever so gently, because I wanted her to stop badgering you and calling you those horrible, horrible names. I just couldn't take it any longer. I wanted to explode. I was so mad. And then she slipped backwards and went tumbling down the stairs. It was just too much for me. I can't believe that this has happened." "Look, it wasn't your fault," came Niles's voice. "She had it coming to her. She's been constantly bullying me and putting me down, and you were only protecting me." "I didn't mean it to happen. I didn't expect her to die like this. I've killed my own mother. I can't believe that this has happened. They're going to lock me up and throw away the keys." "No, not if I have anything to do with it," said Niles. We could hear Julia was sobbing as the digging continued. "If we own up to the authorities, they'll accuse me of deliberately killing her. They'll find that she was pushed over deliberately, and they'd be right." "They'll never find out," said Niles. "It's our secret." "Oh my goodness," I said to my brother in horror. "Julia's only gone and killed her mother, and they're burying her in the woods." We crept behind the tree and began to watch Julia and Niles frantically digging a large hole in the ground. I've never seen Julia look so white before, and her husband looked drained and anxious. I realised that Kingston and I were not alone, as standing behind another tree, literally only yards away from us, was the critter that my brother had seen earlier. I could hardly believe it. I was torn between what was more interesting, watching Julia and Niles digging the grave, or beholding this extraordinary beast, whom seemed as enamoured and intrigued by what Julia and Niles were doing, as indeed we were. Yet Julia and Niles were so caught up with their emotional turmoil that they were blindly oblivious of their very captive audience. It would seem that the creature's awestruck eyes were watching what Julia and Niles were doing with a seemingly dumbfounded and flabbergasted expression upon its face. I could see that the creature was very massive, but I couldn't see him very clearly. I could just observe the red eye shine 8 feet off the ground, and the large body swaying backwards and forwards like a gentle breeze. How long we stood behind the massive girth of an oak tree, watching in confounded horror Julia and Niles digging a huge hole, I do not know. It was almost as if we were watching a gripping movie, as everything was so surreal. Finally we observed Niles carrying the body of his mother-in-law that was wrapped up in a sleeping bag. He laid it down into the shallow grave, and then covered the ground with soil, and Julia began to sob and sob and sob. "I really didn't mean this to happen, Mother. It was a dreadful accident. If only you hadn't kept going on at Niles, this would never have happened. Why did you have to hate him so much? I'm really sorry, Mother. I really am." I watched Julia and her husband walking away from the gravesite towards their gate and retreating back home. I could still hear the sounds of Julia's muffled sobs as they walked away. I felt so much compassion for them both, because it was clearly apparent that this had all been a horrifying accident. That was when we saw the dark, shadowy humanoid silhouette stealthily moving towards the grave. The shafts of moonlight illuminated the long flowing hair of this mysterious creature. What on earth was he, I wondered? The shape was so interesting because he stood up like a man, but was more like a giant, and his arms were very long, with pronounced biceps and exceedingly wide shoulders. His legs were very long and powerful, with prominent muscular definition. The creature was easily over 8 foot tall, possibly about 700 pounds, and easily 3 foot wide. I beheld that he possessed a pyramid-shaped head that seamlessly folded into the shoulders in one neat swoop. The most extraordinary thing of all was that the creature began to dig up the grave very, very fast with his sausage-sized fingers and huge hands. He lifted up the ground so much faster than any trowel could have done, and he did this with such efficiency and swiftness that had me gasping in awe. How could anything move away the soil this fast? For a moment I really thought he wanted to eat the buried dead body of Julia Macy's mother. I watched in stunned disbelief as in seconds this critter retrieved the sleeping bag and drew out the bedraggled-looking body of Julia's mother. For a moment I really thought he wanted to eat the buried dead body of Julia Macy's mother, but it seems I was wrong. I watched in stunned disbelief as in seconds this creature retrieved the sleeping bag and drew out the bedraggled-looking body of Julia Macy's mother, much like you would pull out a popsicle from its paper wrapping. For a moment we beheld her crumpled, pale corpse lying on the ground in a limp, lifeless heap. What on earth was the critter doing, I wondered, as he began to slap Julia's mother's cheeks very hard, almost as if he was trying to wake her up from a deep slumber. All of a sudden Julia's mother coughed and opened her eyes, and when she saw the big critter staring down at her, she screamed in terror. The critter looked so pleased to see Julia's mother alive, and he made several excited whooping sounds, pounding his chest, almost as if he was rewarding himself for a job well done. He then hastily glided away, and we could hear him whooping as he went. He sounded thrilled and happy. It was indeed a miracle of note. Once the creature had gone, I ran up to Julia's mother and asked her if she was all right. "Where am I?" she asked, looking bewildered. "What happened? Why am I in the woods? And why is my mouth full of dirt?" I thought quickly on my feet. "We saw you were sleepwalking," I told her, "and you were digging away in the ground and eating the mud." "Really?" she said, looking aghast. "I'd never do that. I was just having a terrible dream, but I've never slept-walked before. This is very strange." I'm glad to say Julia's mother seemed to buy my bizarre story and seemed confused and disorientated. I hope she did not remember a thing. If she did, she never said a word. She did, however, keep talking about the monster that she'd just seen, and I kept telling her that it was all part of her lucid nightmare because we had seen nothing of the sort. She seemed convinced by my story. I took her back to our home and squeezed her tiny, frail frame through the hole in our fence and brought her into our kitchen. I remember she looked as white and as pale as a ghost and incredibly befuddled and confused. I made her some hot chocolate with lots of marshmallows while my mother phoned Julia to tell her that her mother was at our home and had been found by the two of us sleepwalking in the woods and eating dirt. Julia raced over to our home and nearly fainted when she saw her mother alive and well. I will never forget the shocked expression on her face for as long as I live. She was astounded and bewildered, but she never said anything. "I had a very bad dream," said her mother. "I dreamt that you pushed me down the stairs, buried me in the woods, and attacked me with a monster." Julia laughed awkwardly, and the colour drained from her face. "That was quite some lucid dream you had, Mother. But that's all it was. It was a dream." In the weeks that followed, Julia persuaded her mother from hell to move into a retirement home. How they did that, I don't know, but somehow she managed to persuade her mother to leave for good. I often wonder how they must be racking their brains all these years later, wondering why they thought the concussed woman was dead, and how she managed to manoeuvre herself out of her shallow grave, all on her own. Only my brother and I know what really happened that very fateful night, and we have never ever shared our story with anyone because it's too incredulous to ever believe. But I gather stranger things have indeed happened. In the olden days, they would put a bell in the grave, so if someone was accidentally buried alive, they could actually pull the string on the coffin so that they could be rescued from the grave. So there must have been cases going back in history when people presumed dead were accidentally buried by mistake. Otherwise, they wouldn't have incorporated a fail-safe method of retrieval from within those coffins. So maybe being buried alive is not so extraordinary after all. All these years later, I know what we encountered that night was a Bigfoot, and whether he knew Julia's mother was really alive or not, I will never really know. But Julia's mother's life was indeed saved by the hairy critter, whether she knows it or not. So whatever they say about Bigfoots, some of them are definitely good. So there you are. That is my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Amber, and my Bigfoot encounter happened in 1994 when I was about 25 years old at the time. I grew up near Jefferson County in West Virginia on an exquisitely beautiful apple farm where we grew golden delicious apples. We lived on an idyllic farmstead full of acres of orchards, and we have been very fortunate to produce an abundant crop over many years. because a good apple tree will net you about 800 apples if you're very lucky. Growing up, I had two older brothers, Steve and Michael, who were 15 years older than me. So I was rather like a late lamb, so to speak. And so in many ways I was raised like an only child, as both of my brothers had flown the nest years ago when I was only young. Our farm was very pretty, but if you've been to West Virginia before, you will understand what I mean, as it's an exquisite part of the world to behold. We lived in a symmetrical style farmhouse with a green roof, whitewashed walls, large sash windows, and an extended wraparound porch that embraced the magnificent panoramic views that overlooked orchards on the one side and mountainous valleys and vast areas of natural wood green on the other. If that wasn't enough, we had a pond and a stream that meandered through the wooded area on our land that we also called the Grove. That was literally a natural haven for all kinds of indigenous wildlife, from white-tailed deers to squirrels and you name it. We had it all. I spent copious amounts of time in our sylvan with my very best friend Hayley, who had become like a sister to me. We adored spending time together in the woods, as for some reason majestic imposing trees, natural wondrous wildlife, and sparkling fast-flowing water are just the quintessential combination of Earth's natural wonders that always enhance your sense of pleasure. For indeed this precious sanctuary became for us like a treasured magical secret world, all of our very own, away from prying parents and interfering busybodies. It was our special place that we would love to frequent as often as we possibly could. We would take loads of apples into the sumptuous grove, which we would feed to the very appreciative deer. And there was one particular very quirky little doe with a gregarious and congenial personality who was so tame and affectionate that would often follow us around like a dog. So we called her Meadow. I had never ever heard of a deer behaving like this before, but Meadow was exceptional and we adored her. I even put a large pink leather collar around her neck with her name engraved upon it and the words "Not to be shot" on the tag, so that any potential hunter would hopefully leave her well alone and realise that this tame, endearing doe was like a beloved pet to someone. Hayley and I had a very special relationship, and growing up there were signs that the hairy man was indeed around, possibly watching our every move. But in those days I was blindly oblivious to all the signs that would possibly get my attention now. There were times in the woods when everything would suddenly grow very quiet, and even the bird call would just dissipate all of a sudden, and all you could hear was the sound of water from the stream jetting across the rocky outcrops. Hayley and I would look at each other with perturbed bewilderment on our faces, pondering as to why the birds had suddenly stopped chirping. There were also times when we both got the overwhelming sensation that we were being watched, but we rarely failed to see any sign that this was indeed the truth, because when we looked around our immediate surroundings, there was nobody there. There was one occasion after a heavy rainstorm that we were to discover a trail of muddy footprints that were so gargantuan they looked like they'd been made by a giant. We knew that these were not the footprints of a bear because they had toes, and bears have claws, so Hayley and I were gobsmacked and always pondered as to what this strange creature lurking around the woods could possibly be. I remember we did follow them to the edge of the sylvan and found a large tree-like tent structure that was made from timbers that had been strategically placed over each other so that they reminded me of an Indian wigwam, and there was a large nest in the tepee that was layered with hay, and there was an indentation in this nest that looked like something really big, colossal and hefty had been lying there, but what we couldn't imagine. I do remember the nest smelt like a zoo, like the smell you get from a camel enclosure. We were once again stumped as to what this could possibly be, and who could possibly have made a structure like this, because whoever they were, they had to be very intelligent. Fast forward a few years where my life had become much more about dating boys than spending a lot of time in the woods with my friend Hayley. Instead, we both developed interests that revolved around makeup, clothes, boys and parties. We would spend our time giggling, laughing and gossiping about the people we met and the parties we attended. You know, the usual teenage stuff. By then I'd been dating several very nerdish moonstruck boys, and for some reason I always drew the short straw when it came to picking men. as my tumultuous, turbulent relationships invariably always ended up in disaster. Finally, when I was about 22, I moved away from our farmstead into a student's dig in Charleston, and that was when I began to date a rather dapper-looking policeman called Ted Barber. He was tall, dark and handsome, with piercing blue eyes. For a while our relationship was truly wonderful. Well, it was at first, but that was soon to change as dramatically as from the heat of the summer to the icy coldness of winter. That was how dramatic the changes were in our relationship. I actually met him when he pulled me over to the side of the road for accidentally running a red light. He did let me off with a warning on the one condition that I joined him for a drink. I remember warming to the man's charming demeanour, and so I agreed. I was attracted to Ted from the very start, whether it was his uniform or the fact that he seemed to be such a solid, reliable type, I don't really know. In truth, all the other previous men that I'd dated had all been rather flaky and witless, without any real substance or grit. Ted seemed so different, and his sense of humour was a drawing card for me. Another thing I found very attractive about him was his immense drive and determination, and his extraordinary focus to get ahead in life. By contrast, I was like a whimsical, naive butterfly darting from one flower to another, never quite being able to decide what it was I wanted to do with my life. My mind was as changeable as the weather, so someone who had such direction and was so focused rarely was very appealing to me. As our relationship progressed, suddenly the attractive veneer of the seemingly perfect boyfriend of mine began to slip off. I began to see the egocentric Ted had a very dark side to his character and an insatiable, pompous ego that could not be suppressed by any manner of means. I was to discover that my narcissistic boyfriend was always right, and to disagree with him was treachery and would literally cause him to explode like a volcanic eruption that just could not be contained. He would become so incensed that he would begin to throw things around the house, breaking everything in sight, and once he'd finally calmed down, his apartment invariably looked like it had been ransacked. It was like in his presence you needed to walk on eggshells just to keep the peace. One day when I was having dinner with Ted at his apartment in Charleston, I just happened to mention that his friend Carl was a very attractive-looking police officer that looked like he was going places in the force. Suddenly, the irate Ted looked as if he was growing green at the gills, and his face became crimson with rage, and then he slammed the table defiantly with his fists and threw his plate across the kitchen, where onion gravy and sausages began to trickle and slide down the walls in brown clumps of nasty-looking goo. "I knew it," he screamed. "I knew it. You have the hots for Carl. I've seen the way you've looked at him. You fancy him, don't you? You're a nasty little slapper. You know that." He suddenly became so enraged that he straddled me against the wall and placed his hands over my neck and began to squeeze very tightly, with the intention of killing me. I knew he was strangling me, and I could feel my life ebbing away from me, and at one stage I almost felt as if I was floating out of my body. I tried with all my might to fight back, but I seemed powerless to do anything, although I did try and wiggle and kick as much as I could, but being so slight and petite, my very best efforts were completely useless against Ted's powerful form. All of a sudden he stopped squeezing my neck, as there was a loud knocking at the door, and his father's voice. "Sorry, son," he called. "Can I ask a favour? I'm having some trouble getting my car to start. You couldn't help me, could you?" "Of course, father, I'll help you," said Ted, releasing his tight hold from my neck and glaring at me with defiant eyes as savage as a tiger. He went over to the door to open it for his father, and in that second, in my flight-to-fight response for survival, I made a hasty retreat and stumbled past Ted's father very quickly, who said to Ted, "My word, she's in a hurry." I dived into my car, started up the engine, and hastily accelerated back to my digs as fast as I possibly could, taking sharp, rapid breaths of air. When I finally got back to the digs, I discerned the red marks from Ted's hands around my neck, and they were horrifying to observe in the mirror. I knew beyond a shadow of doubt that if Ted's father had not knocked on his door, I could potentially be dead right now, and that revelation was very hard to come to terms with. As you can imagine, that was the very last time I ever saw Ted, and I warned him that if he ever came near me again, I would definitely call the police. I remember he mocked me and laughed. But I am the police. Do you think anyone in the force is going to believe a word from a silly little girl like you, over a highly esteemed police officer like myself? It was only because Ted was in the force that I didn't actually report what he'd done to me, because I very much doubted I would be taken seriously. I knew his cantankerous temper was dangerous and very much out of control, because when he became incandescent with rage, he could potentially commit murder. He was a very frightening person indeed. As you can imagine, living in Charleston meant that I had not spoken to Hayley for a long time, and imagine my surprise when she called a year later, just out of the blue, and announced off the cuff that she was actually getting married. She wanted me to be her maid of honour for her special day. I was over the moon and exceedingly excited. The wedding was going to be held at her parents' apple farm, and there would be a large marquee and 200 guests. I was told that she'd met the man of her dreams, and she couldn't wait for me to meet him. He's gorgeous, she told me, tall, dark and handsome. I was thrilled for Hayley and eager to meet her dapper fiancé. It would be good to get back home, visit my parents, and pop over to her house for the rehearsal and, of course, pre-wedding party before the wedding day. Fast forward to the night of the rehearsal, where there was going to be a before-wedding party for the immediate family and some close special friends. It was lovely to return home, and I was delighted to see my beloved parents, whom were both in jovial spirits and grilling me intensely on the finer details of university life, and whether I had managed to meet a nice boy yet. A few losers, I said, but nothing worthy of commentary. "You have terrible taste in men, dear," my mother chided. "You want someone like your dad, dear, reliable and solid." "You're right," I confessed, "but men like Dad don't grow on trees, Mother." Before long I was walking down the gravel pathway to Hayley's house, and I could hear loud animated voices, clinking of glasses, laughter and lots of chatter. For a moment I felt rather awkward, like a fish out of water, as I had not seen Hayley for so long. I walked rather anxiously through the entrance hall that was already cluttered with wedding gifts wrapped in fancy ribbons and bows. As I walked through the house, I could see there were tables decked out with sumptuous-looking food, and people helping themselves to delectable snacks and talking intently together. Suddenly Hayley burst through the sliding doors and rushed eagerly towards me, throwing herself into my arms as we embraced. It was so good to see my very best friend, and tears welled up in my eyes. "It's been too long," she said, wiping tears from her face. "Come, I've someone I want you to meet. Come and meet my dark teddy bear." Before I knew it, she was dragging me by the hands towards her fiancé, and when I saw him, I nearly fainted on the spot. It was no other than Ted Barber himself, the very man that had nearly strangled me to death. In that moment, the graphic memories of what he'd done to me that fateful evening came flooding back. I do not know who looked more shocked, Ted or myself. We just stared at each other in utter horror. I remember thinking, "Oh my God, this just cannot be happening." "This is my teddy bear," gushed Hayley. "Is he not so handsome, Amber?" "Ted and I have met before," I said coldly.
"Yes, that's right," Ted interjected. "I'm afraid Amber and I do have a bit of a history. We did date a few times, but I broke it off when I realised that she was falling very hard for me. I knew that there was no future for us because the attraction was not mutual."
Talk about arrogance. I couldn't believe how impertinent Ted was. He looked so smug and conceited as he regarded me with a very jubilant, self-satisfied, smug kind of look on his face. "Oh dear," said Hayley, looking concerned. "I hope I've not made things awkward for you, Amber." "Not at all," I said. As the party continued, I watched Hayley and Ted together. On the surface, they seemed like your quintessential, happy, very much in love couple. But I knew about Ted's insidious, malevolent, dark side, and I simply had to warn Hayley about him. So at the very best opportunity, I asked if I could speak to her alone. But by the looks of things, Ted had already filled Hayley's head with an abundance of fictitious claims about our past relationship, and had spun so many lies to her about me. "I need to talk to you about Ted. He's not who you think he is.
What do you mean? Said Haley.
Well, I know this is going to be hard to believe, Haley, and there's no nice way about saying this, but he did try to kill me once. He got so angry and incensed with me, and then began to throttle and strangle me. That's the truth about how our relationship actually ended.
Stop lying, Amber.
I know what all this is about. It's the green-eyed monster, isn't it? You can't bear it that I'm marrying the man you want. You're so jealous that you're actually smearing Ted's character and reputation with these ridiculous allegations. Now that's nasty of you. I know Ted. He'd never harm a fly, nor raise a hand to a woman. You have changed, Amber, since you went to university. You've become spiteful and mean. I don't like the new you. It's the truth, Amber, I insisted. This is the last thing that I wanted to tell you before your wedding. But I don't want you to marry him, knowing what I know about him. And I needed to warn you because Ted has a very violent, dangerous temper. And your life could be in danger. That's why I have to tell you. There's no other reason. Now that's low, talking about Ted like that. Get out. I don't want you at my wedding. No one who talks about my fiancé like this has any part in my life. I never want to see you again, Amber. Get out. I'm so sorry, Haley. I wanted you to know the truth. I needed to warn you. Out, she screamed. And if I ever see you again, it'll be far too soon. As far as I'm concerned, our friendship is well and truly over. I remember walking away from that party, tears pouring down my cheeks in long streams. I felt so wretched and terrible, like an atrocious, depraved human being that had ruined Haley's life. I drove back to Charleston the very next morning with a huge lump in the back of my throat. I knew I'd done the right thing, warning Haley off Ted, but why did it feel so wrong? Why did I feel this dreadful guilt, self-reproach, and why was I so rueful? I knew that I'd lost my very best friend over the most deplorable man that I'd ever met. I really felt this terrible, anguished hollow inside me, like an emptiness that could never be filled, because Haley was like a sister to me, and now that friendship had withered and died overnight, like a beautiful flower that simply could never be revived. Several months went by and I returned home to our apple farm in West Virginia for a weekend's break, and of course to see my parents. Imagine my amazement when my mother informed me that Haley had been around several times asking after me and eager to know when I'd be getting back. I thought she was living in Charleston with her new husband, I said. What's she doing at her parents' place? Oh, it's a very sad story. Dreadful turn of events. Poor thing. I gather she's getting divorced, my mother told me. She's left that Ted fellow. She's even filed a restraining order against him. Can you believe it? What? I asked in astonishment. Do you know why? Oh, she reckons the man tried to kill her in a fit of rage, but she kicked him in the groin and managed to escape. The poor girl. What she's been through. And he seemed like such a nice fellow. It's the quiet ones you really have to watch, you know. He's a police officer and has been suspended from the force pending an investigation. It's just too terrible. You can't believe that this sort of thing happened next door to us. In a trice, Haley was at my front door, and I was mortified by her startling appearance. She had lost so much weight that her clothes were hanging limply off her body, and her pale face was gaunt, haggard and drawn. Even her blue eyes were framed by telltale dark rims. "What happened to you?" I said, cradling her into my arms like a baby. "You look as if you've been through a meat grinder." "Let's go for a walk in the grove," said Haley, "like the old times. I've so much I need to tell you." I was so excited to take a walk in the Sylvan with Haley, as it had been so long since we'd had a walk there together. "Do you remember Meadow?" I said. "She was such a tame dear. She would follow us everywhere we went. And then she got old. I think dears only live to be about 6 years old, but she hung around us for a good 8 years or so. She lived quite a good life. I think she must have died," reflected Haley. "It was so odd. She was so incredibly tame, don't you think? I mean, she was more like a dog than a deer." "Do you remember the pink collar you bought for Meadow?" she asked. "Oh, I do," I laughed. "I spent all my pocket money on it, and it was leather and top of the range, and cost me a fortune." "You were right," said Haley suddenly. "I should have listened to you. About Ted, I mean. He was a monster. He wasn't right in the head. I did try to warn you, but he was a prince that was really a toad, not the other way round." "I didn't listen," said Haley. "I never knew that Ted would be a complete Jekyll and Hyde." I was to discover from Haley's revelations that she had succumbed to a barrage of abuse from Ted. He had succeeded in breaking Haley's wrist, leg and collarbone, and had thrown her around their apartment like a rag doll. He'd beaten her up, and finally, in a fit of indignant anger, had tried to strangle her to death, just like he did to me. But she was able to break free when she hit him so hard in the groin that, wincing in pain, he retracted his tight hold from her neck, and he doubled over in agony. When she realised how close she'd come to losing her life, she courageously reported everything to the police, many who were Ted's fellow officers. Haley succeeded in filing a restraining order against Ted. It turned out that a few women in the force had also reported Ted behaving inappropriately towards them at work, and also having moments of incandescent rage. "I love it here in the Grove," said Haley. "It brings back so many beautiful memories of our childhood." The sylvan was indeed bewitching, and even more so than I'd remembered, for the oak trees, dogwoods, pines and sycamores had grown taller and fuller, and the forest floor was covered in ferns and rambling pretty foliages, and some of the paths seemed cleared, possibly by my own father. After a while the captivating bird song all but faded, and we were met with the sound of the water cascading and crashing against the rocks. Suddenly we got the shock of our lives when a white-tailed deer came bolting towards us like a happy bounding dog that is eager to greet you and is not reticent in any way. The deer had no trepidation or fear of us, and was treating us much like Meadow had done when she was alive. It was idiosyncratic and anomalous, especially since this deer was wearing Meadow's old pink collar. But it wasn't Meadow. How on earth had that happened? Who had put Meadow's collar on this strange congenial deer that seemed to think that she was a dog? If that was not peculiar and incongruous enough for you, the deer was actually following us around like Meadow had done, which was nothing short of extraordinary, because any hunter will tell you that deers don't behave like this. If they did, they would be easy pickings for anyone who fancied a bit of venison. I could not make any sense of it all. I was completely nonplussed and befuddled. That was when we heard a whistling sound, like a call a man makes when he calls his dogs. All of a sudden the docile deer went scampering up to this huge, hairy humanoid, the likes of such I've never seen before. I knew at once that this deer was this creature's pet, whatever on earth he was. The strange, hairy humanoid seemed as bewildered and stunned to behold us as we were indeed to behold him, possibly because no one had been exploring the sylvan for a very long time. He wasn't expecting such a random off-the-cunt encounter. For a while we stood there gawking at each other, and Haley and I should have been absolutely terrified, but the little deer that was rubbing his head affectionately against the hairy creature made me see clearly that despite his formidable, intimidating appearance, this creature must have had a good heart. I also realised in that moment that maybe the beloved Meadow had also been his pet too, which would explain why she was so fearless in our company. I imagined she had been domesticated by this strange humanoid. I wish I could do justice to you in explaining exactly how this strange creature looked, because he was very human in many aspects of his biology, most especially his long oval face. But I also discerned that he had an emotional intelligence and discernment. He also knew about compassion and love, because the bond he had with that deer was indisputable. The creature was absolutely titanic in size and built for strength, speed and power. His sinewy body was rippled with muscle, and the size of his shoulders and upper torso was something to behold. It was quite frankly colossal. I would say at a guess he was 7 foot tall, 600 pounds and 3 foot wide, and covered in long flowing dark hair, which had an auburn tint. The creature had powerful strong legs, overlong arms, and a dome-shaped head that merged seamlessly into the shoulders in a natural flow. I didn't detect any neck to speak of. The leathery grey oval face was rarely what got my attention because of how human it appeared to be. It possessed a very wrinkled, furrowed brow ridge, flat nose, very slender lips, and he had deep-set, russet gold eyes. I was in total awe of this creature, and was so grateful that the deer was present, because I would have possibly run away screaming at the top of my lungs if it had not been the case. I was almost certain that the creature could have killed us both, yet looking at him, I knew he was a reasoning being and could sense that he wasn't a hardened killer, and I know he recognized the humanity in us that he was aware existed within himself. And why would you attack something that held a resemblance to yourself? That would be crazy. As bizarre and as incredulous as this sounds, I felt as if the creature recognized and knew us. I reflected on my childhood memories and the times we'd felt as if something had been watching us. Was it him, I wondered? Had he been watching Haley and I over the years, playing around in the woods together? I reflected on the nest that we had found all those years ago, and the large tracks in the mud. It was all beginning to make sense now. The little deer was nuzzling the critter, and with such affection and love, and I watched his big hands and sausage-sized fingers stroke the deer very tenderly. For a moment, no one said anything, until the creature turned around and whistled to the deer, who followed him back into the woods obediently. We watched him move away, and as he did so, he turned around once and nodded to us as if he was saying goodbye. In that moment, my heart literally lifted and warmed to the creature, but what he was, I could not imagine. Looking back, what we saw that day, I am certain Haley and I encountered a Bigfoot. I sense he lived in those woods for many years and was well acquainted and familiar with the both of us. I think that although I'm sure he must eat venison, which is deer, I think he keeps a deer as a pet, which makes sense to me. Maybe he rescued it when it was a fawn or something. After all, if they have human-like characteristics, why would they not keep a pet like any of us would? On the subject of Ted, I'm glad to tell you he was turfed out of the police force and went on several anger management courses, but what he's doing now, I can't imagine, and I don't care. I'm glad to say that Haley and I are still very best friends, with children and husbands of our own. And finally we struck pay dirt, because we found ourselves very good men. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Rowan, and I'm from Calgary in Alberta, Canada, which is close to the Rocky Mountains, Banff, Canmore, Lake Louise, and so much more. It's such a spectacular part of the world to behold, and it's not uncommon to encounter moose, deer, or even bear crossing your path when you're driving down some of the roads here. So invariably you always feel so close to nature living in this part of the world. You definitely are spoilt by the resplendent and variable range of wondrous natural masterpieces, such as stunning waterfalls, glaciers, prairies, mountains, cliffs, hills, pastoral land, ravines and rainforests, and of course so many other natural wonders that will quite literally take your breath away. As one prolific writer of the 80s so eloquently put it, when you behold the turquoise waters of Lake Louise, you are in no doubt that there is a God. Calgary itself is known as the centre of Canada's oil industry, and is a city with numerous skyscrapers, shops, quaint boutiques, quirky cafes, and highly esteemed restaurants. I've always enjoyed shopping here, or drinking coffee in one of the coffee shops, or dining out in one of the excellent restaurants here, and enjoying the cultural variance from Chinese to Asian and European food. I grew up here in a green leafy neighbourhood in the early 80s, close to downtown Calgary, where property prices can be pretty steep if you are situated in close proximity to the town. My family moved here when I was about 10 years old from Toronto, and we never ever looked back, because the awe-inspiring scenic views in this part of the world are far superior to those of Toronto. Growing up, I lived in a duplex, which was a stunning house divided in the middle into two homes with two separate front doors. One side of the house belonged to our family, which consisted of my parents and my younger sister Abby. The other side of the house belonged to another family called the Robinsons, who were very congenial, fun-loving people. In those days, my father worked in the aerospace and logistics industry, while my mother stayed at home to take care of us. We truly were incredibly blessed with a utopian lifestyle that meant that during the weekends we could go exploring, hiking, camping, fishing, horse riding, swimming, cycling, and so much more. And from a very early age I developed a huge passion for the natural world. I would marvel at the incredible, awesome beauty of nature. I was transfixed by glaciers, mountains, volcanoes, and turquoise lakes.
much like Lake Louise, that would quite literally take my breath away.
When I was about 10 years old, I was given my first Instamatic camera for a Christmas present, which was a decision my father would later live to regret. Before long, I was taking pictures of absolutely everything, and those pictures that I took were rarely beautiful from a less than adequate camera, from a professional aspect, of course. Practically speaking, those Instamatics were brilliant for their day. Some of my photographs my mother chose to frame because they were exceptionally good. Even now, looking back at some of those old pictures, I marvel that I actually took them with a run-of-the-mill Instamatic camera. It seems hard to believe. Shortly after acquiring my camera, it was a catalyst for engendering in me an ardent and fervent passion for photography. I perceived that when I became older, I wanted to become an aspiring artist of the natural world, with my paintbrush being my camera lens, and the colours being the soft light, shapes, textures and colours of Mother Nature herself. As you can imagine, my father was far from pleased when I expressed my whimsical, naive and childlike desire to him about my aspirations to become a photographic artist of the natural world.
"Son, you are bright," he told me. "You have a good head on those young shoulders of yours. One day when you get married, you need to find a skilled job to provide for your family. Photography is never ever going to reward you financially, unless you get into something as mundane as wedding photography, and even that is not going to guarantee you a good income. Worse still, can you imagine dealing with a bunch of fractious, fastidious and tiresome brides? I couldn't imagine anything worse myself. I wouldn't even wish such torture on any son of mine."
"I don't want a pedestrian monochromatic job like you," I protested. "I want to take beautiful pictures of the natural world."
"Son, it's never about what you want," my father said. "It's about what you have to do to put bread on the table, to provide for your family, as that is all that matters. Do you think for a single moment I enjoy going to my humdrum, prosaic job every day? Not on your Nelly, but I do it for you and for your mother, and for your sister, of course. It's called sacrifice for the greater good."
"You mean you don't even enjoy your job?" I asked in horror. "How can you do something so uninspiring that you absolutely hate?" I said. "It makes no sense to me at all."
"Son, it makes perfect sense. It's called survival. Do you think a lion enjoys stalking its prey? Of course not, but it does so to subsist. Do you think a squirrel loves storing its acorns over the winter months? Of course not, but it does so to prevail. Do you think a bear enjoys lockdown for its winter hibernation? Of course not."
"How do you know the lion does not enjoy hunting?" I protested.
"I just know," said my father.
There was no point in arguing with my stubborn, tenacious and opinionated dad, because he had very fixed, intractable views about the world, but I was not going to take his unyielding advice. I knew that I could never spend the rest of my life in a monotonous, dull job like my father. I wanted something so much better for myself. I had absolutely no intentions of following his willful example. I wanted to pursue my dreams and embark upon a profession that intrigued, excited and inspired me. Somehow I knew I would make it pay. That's what I thought to myself. I began to visualize books of my photographs perched on coffee tables throughout North America and Europe. Surely my dream was attainable. It was not too good to be true, was it? One day my mother was having tea with Irma Robinson, the lady who lived in the subdivided side of our home. In recent years she had blossomed into becoming one of my mother's most beloved and best friends. I remember on this particular day, which I imagine was probably a Monday morning, she came bolting into our kitchen like a bull in a china shop, and she eagerly confessed that they had returned from a hiking trip over the weekend. I noticed her face look pink and flustered, and she seemed rather excitable, like a Jack Russell Terrier that was eager for his walk. "You'll never believe what happened to us," she said, gulping down her coffee quickly. and looking as if she was bursting to tell us something incredulous that she could not wait to share. "Go on," said my mother. "Out with it. I'm dying to know what happened to you. I can see you're champing at the bit to tell us." "Well, Peter and I were hiking at Devil's Thumb near Lake Louise, and I really got the uneasy feeling that someone was watching me. I kept looking around me, but I saw absolutely nothing. But I was disturbed and edgy because the feeling was so strong. You know that feeling you get when someone is looking at you? Peter and I were standing on a high rocky ridge, where upon looking down the vast rocky incline, you observed the exquisite aquamarine waters of Lake Louise below us. We were on a very steep hiking trail, dotted with ubiquitous alpine trees and white-barked pines. Once again I felt as if something was staring at me, and it was very unsettling, disquieting and creepy, that kind of feeling that sent chills down my spine. All of a sudden, something hit me firmly in my back, and I turned around to see that it was a pine cone. I thought that some stranger on the hiking trail was hiding in the shadows, trying to scare me, but there were no people on our trail at all. It was deathly quiet. On reflection, I don't think I even remember any birdsong in the valley at all. There really was not a solitary soul in our sight, and it was deadly quiet, and there was a strange musty smell in the air that reminded me of wet dog. It was really rather pungent and unpleasant. "Wow," said my mother, "now that is odd, especially for one of those hiking trails near Lake Louise. No one being around, I mean. There are usually loads of tourists bustling around that place." "Yes, come to think of it, it was rather peculiar, and hauntingly quiet, I might add. Anyway, after one pine cone was thrown at me, then there was another and another and another, so someone was throwing pine cones at me deliberately and with startling accuracy. Even Peter was absolutely confounded, and he said, "What the heck?" He even called out and said, "Please stop throwing pine cones at my wife. It's not funny." He also believed that there was a kid on the trail having a good laugh at my expense, and he wasn't best pleased about it. We couldn't see anything, but we began to hear a chuckling sound, almost as if someone was delighting in how flabbergasted and bewildered I had become by being bombarded by all these pine cones. They were clearly finding it all a terrible hoot, and Peter was far from amused. He kept saying under his breath, "Bloody kids," over and over again. His face had grown crimson, and he looked exceedingly flustered. Suddenly I saw something very dark moving behind one of the trees, and I thought it was a bear. I had my binoculars with me, and so I focused them directly on the creature, and I nearly passed out in shock. I was seeing a Homo sapien in my binoculars, and I'm not kidding either. "What's a Homo sapien, Mother?" I asked, looking mystified. "It's early man, sweetheart. They're often referred to as archaic humans," my mother said. "Now you have me stumped, Irma. How is that even possible?" "That's exactly what I was thinking. I mean, early man died out 50,000 years ago. But that is exactly what I saw." "Irma, you must be mistaken, dear," said my mother. "You must have seen something very different. It couldn't have been a Homo sapien. Surely not." Emma looked exceedingly frustrated. "You sound just as scathing and disparaging as Peter. He kept telling me I must have seen a bear. But I know what I saw," she said defiantly, looking like an obstinate kid who was not getting her way, and she was very mad about it. I must admit I thought in that second that she would begin to stamp her feet and have a hissy fit. That was how petulant her face looked. "Why do you not describe it to us, dear?" said my mother, trying to be understanding and considerate. "Well, it was very big, much bigger than you or I, and exceedingly tall. It was covered in long, shaggy, dark brown hair, and it had a dome-shaped head that was sitting on its shoulders much like a boiled egg in a cup. It looked like it was half human and half ape, just like those evolution pictures you see of early man merging from an ape into a human. It looked exactly like that, Homo sapien, as I told you." What was it doing? Asked my mother. Well, it knew I was watching it from my binoculars. How it knew that, I have no idea. It looked directly at me through the lenses. I could see its deep-set, treacle-brown eyes, and it seemed to be laughing at me. I handed the binoculars to Peter very quickly, and then he only saw the creature quickly retreating away, and was certain that it was a bear. But I know what I saw, and it was no bear. I can assure you of that. Maybe it was a bear, dear, said my mother. It could have been a trick of the light that distorted the focus on its face, because that can happen from time to time. I could see that Emma was growing increasingly incensed, and in her annoyance her pale face developed a distinctive crimson hue, which made me wonder if she was about to explode with anger in any given moment. Right, so bears have hands with human fingers and smooth nail beds, do they? She challenged my mother. This thing had a human face, and hands and fingers and flat nails. Now that's no bear. Bears have paws. Of course they do, dear, said my mother. But I still think you were fooled by a trick of the light, dear. You know what, Jenny, said Irma. Thanks a lot for listening. And thanks for being so perfunctory and dismissive. I thought you were my friend. I thought that you of all people would believe me. But I can see that I was very wrong. Well, thanks a lot for absolutely nothing. Irma impulsively thrust her coffee in the air, aiming it directly at my mother's shocked face, and it spilt all over the front of her dress, soaking it in a dark brown stain. You deserve that, she said. Oh, and by the way, Jenny, I've been meaning to tell you that you make the most disgusting, insipid coffee that tastes like dishwater soap. And with that she stormed out, slamming the door behind her so hard that my mother and I nearly jumped out of our skin. Oh, goodness gracious! I never, said my mother. Talk about overreacting. Look at me, she said, dabbing off the coffee from her face with a kitchen towel. How dare she throw her coffee in my face like that? Talk about being downright rude. Who does she think she is? As for telling me that my coffee tastes like dish soap, now that's downright nasty. All this pent-up emotion because I just don't believe she saw a Homo sapien. Have you ever heard anything so ridiculous in your entire life? The woman is barking mad. I think you were really mean, Mum, I said. You could at least have pretended to believe her. You really upset her. And as for your coffee, she is right. It is insipid and very nasty. You also think my coffee is awful, said my mother, looking aghast. Why didn't you tell me that before? I didn't want to hurt your feelings, Mother. But since you've hurt Irma's feelings, I think I'll hurt yours, so you know exactly what it feels like. Darling, I'm not going to pretend to believe in something so incredulous and so ridiculous. We both know that Irma saw a bear. I don't agree, Mum. I believe she actually saw something, and I don't think it was a bear. I think it's presumptuous of us to assume that we know everything out there in the wilderness. It's huge out there. For all you know, there could be things out there that haven't even been identified by science. Do you realise how much of North America has been uncharted by man? This coming from a 12-year-old boy, laughed my mother. I am impressed. You are wise beyond your years, son, she said, kissing me on the cheeks. You are making some good points, dear, but I still say Irma saw a bear, and I'm firmly sticking to my guns on that. Fast forward to when I was 18 years old, where I would hike regularly and camp solo for photographic opportunities. I would frequent areas of natural wilderness, some so remote that few people have ventured into those areas. I was determined to refine my skills as an up-and-coming photographer, and I was visiting areas of Canada where I was taking some ravishing photographs of glaciers, turquoise lakes and forests. At this stage of my life, I was using very professional cameras that were available in the 80s and developing my own photographs. On one occasion, I took a remote wilderness trail in Canada where I'd been told I'd find some incredible footage of rocky ravines, mountainous ridges and sumptuous forests, and so I enthusiastically embarked upon an exciting wilderness adventure all of my own. After an arduous, tumultuous day spent hiking, I finally settled down for the evening, where I camped by a gushing stream that sparkled in the noonday sun with a silvery sheen and was surrounded by smooth, rather sculptural-looking rocky outcrops. I found the quintessential, very attractive open clearing for my campsite, flanked by tall, statuous, verdant alpine pine trees. I pitched my two-man tent and prepared a fire pit and sat down on a smooth rock that made the most perfect chair to sit on. I proceeded to boil a pot of water to make a very nice pot of beef soup, which I ate with some large hunks of wholemeal bread. It was a beautiful day, and I watched the mesmerizing sun setting over the valley in rich tangerines, golds and yellows, until finally the sky was painted in a light grey that deepened and gradually darkened, until finally the vast firmament was sprinkled with a kaleidoscope of twinkling silvery stars, and there was a bright, luminescent ivory full moon that made the night seem very bright and enchanting. I've always been a deep, sound sleeper, so much so that I've known to sleep through noisy thunderstorms without ever being awakened or disturbed by that noise. It would seem that every time my belly is full and satisfied, I tend to start nodding off. Perhaps my body directs all its energy towards digestion, which brings on the sleepiness. On this evening it was no exception, and after I'd eaten I could feel the familiar waves of exhaustion overcome my body. So I dutifully retired to my tent, and the moment I hit my sleeping bag, I was out like a light. I remember during the night having a weird, rather quirky feeling or sensational dream. I dreamt that these dark, shadowy figures covered in long hair were dragging my sleeping bag across the ground, and it seemed so vivid and real, but I knew it was only a dream. Imagine my amazement when I woke up in the early morning to find shafts of sunlight beaming directly on my face, causing me to squint because the light was so incredibly bright, and it was a very warm and pleasant day. I could not believe what I was actually seeing. I was lying in my sleeping bag in the middle of an open prairie of long grass, pretty wildflowers, butterflies and deers grazing close by. How on earth had I got here? I wondered, sitting up in absolute wonderment and utter astonishment as I beheld my surroundings. I was utterly dumbfounded and confused. My campsite was 20 minutes away. Nothing made any sense at all. How on earth had I got out here? When the deer saw me, they looked surprised and quickly scampered away, seemingly startled and perturbed by my strange presence, as I emerged from the undergrowth so suddenly and unexpectedly. I could swear I could hear the strange chuckling sound, rather like a bird having a good laugh at my expense, rather like the kookaburra in Australia. It sounded uncannily like that. I've always been a rational person, so I told myself that I must have sleepwalked during the night, dragging my sleeping bag with me. I knew that I had sleptwalked when I was 4. Perhaps it was happening all over again. What a bummer, I thought. My mother told me that she had once found me walking across our yard in the middle of the night, with my eyes glazed over as I was acting out my dream in a sleep-induced state. I was astounded that I'd walked so far in my sleep, but I could discern that my sleeping bag was indeed covered in mud and leaves, as you would have expected. This was a deep concern to me, because knowing that I was now predisposed to sleepwalking was worrisome for me, especially being out in nature like this, exposed to all manner of wild animals. It certainly placed me in a rather vulnerable, precarious predicament. I did reflect on my strange dream that I'd had during the night, but I altogether dismissed it out of hand and put it at the back of my mind as just that, a bizarre and rather weird dream. That night, when I retired to my tent for some shut-eye, I placed a couple of small rocks in my sleeping bag in the hope that they would jolt me awake should I get up in the middle of the night to go sleepwalking all over again. I really didn't want that to happen. Imagine my amazement when during the night I was indeed jolted awake when one of my rocks in my sleeping bag hit me very hard on the side of my arm. I opened my eyes very suddenly, startled to see 2 massive humanoid creatures dragging me along the ground in my sleeping bag outside of the tent. They were doing this very quietly, and then they picked me up in my sleeping bag like a sack of potatoes and carried me out into the prairie, where they gently placed me on the ground in the middle of the long grass there. They almost seemed to be chuckling together, as if they thought this was a huge practical joke, and they were whispering together in low tones so as not to wake me up, in a language that sounded a lot like gibberish. Luckily, with the light of the moon, the shafts of moonlight lit up the creatures, and I could not believe what I was seeing.
I tried to keep my eyes as closed as I possibly could while I observed them. The creatures were exactly what Irma Robinson had once described when I was only 12 years old. They looked like humanoid apes, with tall, burly bodies covered in long flowing hair and pyramid-shaped heads that flowed seamlessly into a gargantuan pair of shoulders, and their bodies were powerful and strong. I should have been terrified, but I sensed that these creatures were playing a practical joke on me, and clearly had a great sense of humour. If they had indeed meant to harm me, they would have hurt me already by now. So I remained calm, speechless, and in total awe of what I was indeed beholding. As I was contemplating all of this, I could hear this thundering noise that sounded like a rhino charging in the thicket, and that was when I saw her. She was colossal, far bigger than the two critters that had dragged me into the prairie. But this critter was female because she had very large, pillowy, hair-covered breasts. I realised that the two small critters were clearly her offspring, and she seemed far from amused and very incensed with their practical joke. I could tell by the tone of her voice that she was reprimanding them and giving them a huge telling off, and they were hanging their heads in shame, looking exceedingly guilty, like two kids who got caught with their hands in the cookie jar. She kept pointing at me in my sleeping bag, and then she pointed an accusory sausage-sized finger at them, as if to say, "I've had just about enough of your shenanigans. Now put him back where you found him at once." The next thing I knew is that the two practical jokers were obediently carrying me in my sleeping bag back to my camping site, and they dragged me in my sleeping bag back into the tent. It was so surreal that I couldn't believe what had just transpired, but despite everything, I still managed to fall asleep, and I awoke the next morning to find two fresh fish hanging together in a vine leaf on a hook outside of my tent. I knew at once that it was a gift from the creatures by way of an apology, upon the insistence of their mother, I imagine, and I was amazed at the etiquette of these extraordinary, intelligent beings, who clearly have a great sense of humour. Yet I had no comprehension of what these creatures could actually be, and it was only 20 years later that I would finally discover that these mysterious ape-like humanoids were in fact Bigfoots. I will add that the fish that they caught for me I cooked and ate that breakfast, and it was melt in the mouth, flaky and absolutely delicious, and to date, quite simply, the most delectable, sumptuous fish that I've ever tasted, that far outrivals any of Calgary's finest fish restaurants, and I'm not joking either. Fast forward to a week after my anomalous, rather extraordinary encounter, and my mother and I were standing with a huge bouquet of flowers, a box of chocolates and some chocolate and almond croissants from the baker's, and we were ringing Irma Robinson's front doorbell. "Hello there," she said, looking at us with an astonished look on her face. "What is this all about?" she asked. "It's not my birthday, is it?" she joked, looking at all the flowers. "Can we come in?" said my mother. "I've some almond croissants for you. I know how you like them." Irma looked delighted. "My favourite," she said. "My mouth is already watering. Come in. I'll make us some coffee to have with them, and then you can tell me what this is all about." "I've come to express my extreme apologies, Irma," said my mother, "for not believing you about the Homo sapiens you saw all those years ago." Irma looked baffled. "Why are you apologising now? You didn't believe me then, so that's that. I don't understand." "Rowan saw 3 of them," said my mother, "near Lake Louise. Exactly what you saw." "You did?" said Irma, looking amazed. "You saw the Homo sapiens like I did?" "Well, I'm not sure they are Homo sapiens, but I definitely saw exactly what you saw," I told her, "and I absolutely believe you." "Wow," said Irma, "I'm amazed. You know how much I've wanted you to believe me all these years. I've even prayed about it because there's nothing more disheartening than being disbelieved and ridiculed. I know better now than to tell people what I saw all those years ago because everybody makes fun of me and nobody believes me." I proceeded to tell Irma my extraordinary story. "Wow," she said, "I would have freaked out waking up in the prairie like that. It would terrify me. I can't believe you stayed there for a second night. I would have booted out of there faster than greased lightning. Weren't you absolutely petrified?" "No, I wasn't, because initially I was sure that I'd just sleepwalked. I did once sleepwalk when I was 4 years old, so I thought the problem had just come back to haunt me all over again, and that is what disturbed me. On the second night, when I was awoken to those creatures dragging my bag, I reconciled myself to the fact that if these critters meant to harm me, they would have already harmed me already. You see, they weren't menacing in any way. I could sense they were having a laugh at my expense. To tell you the truth, I was more in awe of them than afraid. I think they do have a sense of humour, Irma admitted. The one throwing pine cones at me most certainly did, and was clearly amused by how shocked I was in my reactions. That's it, I said. I remember the first morning I woke up in the middle of the prairie. I could hear this strange bird-like laughter. The critters wanted to see my shocked reaction when I woke up in the middle of the prairie. It all makes sense now. They were laughing at me and found it all terribly amusing. And on reflection, I suppose it really was. They must be intelligent creatures, said my mother reflectively, because a sense of humour is birthed from perceiving, understanding, discerning, and like knowing, and that would make them very clever. For many long years I pondered what I'd seen, although through all my travels I never got to see the creatures again, and that was very disappointing for me, because I had hoped for another encounter. But I'm very glad to inform you that I did make my living as a photographer, and over the years I have been responsible for the most amazing magazine covers, art gallery exhibitions, coffee table books, postcards, and so much more. And what's more, I made myself a good living out of it and continue to do so. So my advice to you and all your listeners is to follow your passions. Even my father has admitted in recent years that he really regrets not doing in life the very things that brought him the most joy, and that is one of his biggest long-time regrets. So what I'd like to say to you is to follow your hearts, and the rest will follow, including the financial resources for you. I emphatically believe that where we find our passions is where our life purpose is rooted, and what we were divinely ordained to do on this earth. So therefore it will never fail, and will ultimately always be blessed, because it was already pre-planned before we were born, and what is meant to be simply cannot fail. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all of your lovely listeners, never for a moment did I ever envisage sharing my story with you and your listeners, because it means unveiling a very dark, insidious side of myself that I would so much rather forget. Yet I am very determined to share my story with you and your lovely listeners, because bringing the dark into the light is supposed to ultimately set you free, and I most certainly need that in my life in every respect. Before I begin my story, I would like to introduce you to myself. My name is Ursula, and I'm from the Pacific Northwest, and have lived in this part of the world pretty much all of my life. Growing up, I had a very affluent upper-middle-class life, where I went to the finest schools and enjoyed the advantages of living in a very attractive Cape Cod-style home in an upper-class leafy green neighbourhood, where I enjoyed the privileges of the finer things in life. I was raised by my wealthy parents, who made their money from textiles, and I had 2 younger siblings, both of them boys. As very spoilt, self-entitled kids, we were whisked off on costly, luxurious locations, like skiing in Aspen, visiting the Serengeti in Kenya to watch the Great Migration, and enjoying swanky deluxe cruises on the Regent Seven Seas Explorer around the world, and lavish train journeys like the Maharajas Express in India and the Golden Eagles Trans-Siberian Express train in Russia. You name it, and we probably did it. When I was about 23 years old, I finally got married to my boyfriend, who was 5 years my senior, who had a great job working as a solicitor in the local town. While at the time I was working as a receptionist for a cosmetic surgery office, dealing with clients desiring a nip and a tuck here and there, or a few cosmetic enhancements or procedures. Before long, I left my job to raise my 2 children, Kyla and Candace, from home. I found the life of a stay-at-home mother colourless, monotonous and dreary. I'd meet my friends for coffee at the local coffee shop, or have our hair and nails done at the beauty parlour. And while these rendezvous were indeed fun, I longed for so much more. In truth, I found the tireless drudgery of the daily pedestrian stodgy routines really rather drab and mundane. Looking after 2 tumultuous, difficult kids also frazzled my nerves.
One day I was having coffee on my own at the local coffee shop, as my friend had failed to show up on this occasion, as unfortunately one of her kids had cut his finger and needed stitches at the local surgery. I was drinking coffee alone, feeling rather downcast and jaded, when a mysterious lady that I'd never ever met before asked if she could join me for coffee, because she didn't want to be on her own, and she fancied some cheerful company. I found out that her name was Rebecca. She was an attractive woman with blonde shoulder-length hair and blue eyes, but she did look a little rough around the edges, which possibly suggested that she had a tough life growing up. I found out later that this was most certainly the case, as she had been one of those poor girls that had drifted from one foster home to another, and her life had been devoid of privileges and parental love. She was wearing a pair of Levi jeans, some very stylish cowboy boots, and a rarely flattering cowgirl hat that made her look fetchingly dapper. So much so, in fact, that she was receiving a couple of approving glances from men in the coffee shop, who looked like they wished with all their hearts that they were sitting in my seat instead of me. Who could blame them, as Rebecca was the most electrifying person that I'd ever had the privilege to meet in a very long time. Before long, she began telling me all these riveting, intoxicating stories about her incredible life, and it sounded so thrilling and enthralling to me compared to the humdrum, monochromatic and insipid life that I felt I was leading. I hung on to her every word, with eyes growing as round as saucers and my jaw hanging open in utter astonishment as she began to share some extraordinary confessions to me that quite literally boggled my mind. I break into houses, she told me, and it's rip-roaring fun. I've taken so many things, from Christian Dior handbags to Cartier watches, diamonds, jewellery and china, and almost anything that I can get my hands on. Are you not scared of being caught? I asked, looking at her with an expression of wonderment on my face. No, of course not. Don't you see that it's all part of the buzz, getting away with it, she laughed. It's all the fun. I see what you mean, I said. Almost like an adrenaline-charged high, I suppose. Exactly like that, she said. It feels so good to get away with something, and not being caught is the most galvanizing part of it all. It makes you feel on top of the world, like you can conquer almost anything. Wow, I said. What do you do with all the stuff that you take? Sell it, of course, she said. But I don't steal because of the stuff I get. I do it for the buzz, the suspense and the adrenaline rush. It kind of gives me a high, and it's an addictive feeling. Although stealing the stuff does bring in some good money. I can't deny that, of course. I think I know what you're getting at, I said reflectively. Living on a knife's edge is riveting, which is why some people walk on those high skyscrapers without any protective gear on, so if they fall, they're dead. It's like the risk of dying heightens their pleasure. I think you've got it exactly right, girl, said Rebecca, giving me a high five. It's also interesting snooping around people's houses. You'll be amazed the things you learn and find out. People are very fascinating, and some of them have big secrets. I envy you so much, I said. I so wish I had the courage to do what you do. But I'd not have a clue how to break into somebody's house, and even if I did, I doubt I'd have the courage to go through with it. I'd probably wimp out and lose my nerve. Nonsense, laughed Rebecca. You underestimate yourself. I think you've got nerves of steel in there. I tell you what, I'll show you how to break into a house. It's much easier than you think. All right, I said. Why not? I'll give it a go. The following Saturday night I met up with Rebecca, and she showed me a good way to break into a random person's house, although on this occasion she had chosen a house belonging to a person of significant means. We put on rubber gloves to ensure we left no fingerprints and wore sneakers 3 times bigger than our feet, so that if our footprints were indeed discovered, the police would believe the perpetrator was a man. I remember my heart was thumping violently in my chest, not from fear, but with excited enthusiasm and heightened apprehension. What if we get caught, I thought, and those thoughts only escalated my rising euphoria and the adrenaline spikes that I was clearly receiving. Look, there's a window here that's been left open, she told me. This means we can access inside the house pretty easily. And I was amazed to see that Rebecca had a vast selection of incredibly professional-looking housebreaking tools,
perfect for the job at hand. I was in awe. She truly was a professional and knew exactly what she was doing. Now, you mustn't worry, she assured me, about being caught. I've been watching the house for several days now. The couple's always out on a Saturday night until about 12:30, and they don't have an alarm system. How do you know all that? I asked in amazement. It's called sleuthing, she giggled, tapping her nose. I'll never forget the first time we broke into this palatial-looking Italianite home that was very grandiose and quite literally an Aladdin's cave of all kinds of things and curios from around the world. I could see that whoever lived in this house was exceedingly stylish, well-travelled, and very passionate about horses. I remember being so bedazzled and bewitched in looking around this incredibly posh home and being mesmerised by all kinds of exotic, captivating trinkets. I was also opening out wardrobes and trying on designer outfits and admiring my own reflection in the mirror. I put on all her wigs, hats and jackets, leaving chaos all over the room and a floor strewn with clothes, shoes and handbags. Rebecca encouraged me to take whatever it is that I wanted. I looked around, and that was when I observed this exquisitely beautiful statue of a horse. It was galloping, and it was seated on a mahogany desk. It was possibly worth an absolute fortune, and so I decided that's what I'd take. After the burglary, I felt animated and alive, as breaking into somebody's house was so exhilarating. I remember thinking to myself, I'm a burglar, and that seemed so much more arresting than being a boring stay-at-home mother. Never once did I ever consider the long-term ramifications of what I was actually doing, and how playing with fire would ultimately lead to getting burnt. I did not consider the high cost of these daring escapades, and what I ultimately finally stood to lose if I was caught, which invariably always happens. Nor did I consider the devastating impact such choices would ultimately have on my family, and the shameful embarrassment that I would cause to my husband, children, and parents. You may ask why a middle-class woman like myself, born with privileges and a great education, would do something so despicable and invasive as breaking into a person's house. But I guess I was a bored housewife looking to live on the edge, and breaking into that house was possibly the most exciting thing that I'd done in a very long time. It got even more enthralling for me when there was a write-up in the local paper about the missing horse statue that I'd stolen. It read, Mr. Pierre Rousseau was burgled on Saturday night, and an object of great personal and sentimental value was stolen from his home. A treasured sculpture of a galloping horse done in limestone by a master sculptor has gone missing. They could have taken anything else, said Pierre, tears welling up in his eyes, but that was my finest piece of art that I treasured more than anything else. If anyone knows the whereabouts of this treasured piece of art, please call 32245 and speak to Detective Van Vuren. I will admit I felt quietly bad for Mr. Rousseau losing his galloping horse, but I was not about to give it back to him. It did not take much for Rebecca to persuade me to rob houses with her on a regular basis, and there were times when we narrowly missed being caught by the police, and those were the most gripping times of all. When we successfully eluded the police, we became like two giggly schoolkids who thought they'd got away with something. We would sit there laughing and high-fiving each other and drinking Cabernet Sauvignon to celebrate. Sometimes we worked up such an appetite that we became ravenous after some thieving that we would go out to paint the town red and tuck into a delicious steak dinner at our favourite diner. I would return home so invigorated and so pumped up that even my husband commented on my positive frame of mind and how upbeat I had become of late. You may rightly ask where my husband was when all this was going on. Well, he was at home taking care of our kids. I had agreed that if he gave me Saturday evenings to spend with Rebecca, then he could spend his Sundays fishing with his best buddy Noah, and that sealed the deal for him because my husband simply adored to fish. I found being upper middle class to be a distinct advantage when I would sell the items that I'd stolen, because I could go to antique dealers and second-hand jewellers, and no one would ever raise an eyebrow. Why would they suspect someone from my kind of background? No one suspected an upper middle class wealthy housewife to be guilty of the crimes I was now accomplished at committing. I was getting much more assertive and audacious about what I was doing, almost cocky if you like, because that's how brazen I had become.
One day as my friend and I were breaking into a very grand, swanky-looking Victorian home that was flanked by a vast wooded area that stretched back for many miles and was bordered by a fence, I suddenly got a very strong, ominous feeling in my gut that something wasn't right, but I chose not to listen to those warning signals. As we were snooping around the house, we heard the sound of police sirens, car wheels crunching on the gravel on the driveway. We could hear car doors slamming, running feet, unofficial-sounding voices that must have been police officers. That was when we knew we were cornered by the police, but we were able to open a glass sliding door in the back of the house and make a quick dash towards the fence, which we climbed hurriedly. We began to run into the Sylvan, knowing that we could potentially be pursued, so we ran for a very long time, deeper and deeper into the woods. After a while, Rebecca told me to finally relax. "I think we're fine," she assured me. "If they were following us now, we would have heard them." I was panting so much from the exhilaration of running that I slumped down exhausted against the girth of a large oak tree, feeling absolutely worn out. "Whew, that was close," I said. We nearly got caught." Suddenly we both began to laugh. "We did it again," I said, feeling thrilled and giving Rebecca another high five. "Let's relax for a while," said Rebecca, "and then we can navigate our way out of here, if of course we can." "It's beautiful in here," I said. "I can't remember the last time I was ever in a woods." The Sylvan was indeed magnificent, as the gigantic trunks of these tall, imposing trees just towered above us in horizontal lines, and the bushy heads of thick leaves provided a shaded canopy for us. The shafts of sunlight darted between the branches and brushed the forest floor in pretty prisms of soft, flattering light, and the floor was carpeted in lacy ferns and pretty flowering foliages. I marvelled at the extraordinary beauty of this shaded retreat that was alive with the warbles and tweets of pretty birdsong. "Look at that squirrel," I said to Rebecca, as the little furry critter stopped suddenly on the tree branch and studied us ever so curiously through big sparkling brown eyes, and then finally retreated to a higher branch while it stuffed its face with the acorn it was nibbling. All the while it watched us with a very deep interest. All of a sudden we heard the sound of rustling leaves being crunched beneath two sets of heavy feet, and we knew people were coming. "Quick, hide," said Rebecca. "Someone's coming." We immediately tiptoed towards a tree and hid ourselves behind its massive girth. We could hear the sounds of chatter, as if two people were having an intense conversation, but whoever they were certainly not speaking English. In truth, it sounded like they were talking in gibberish, but how is that even possible? It must be some strange language that I wasn't acquainted with, I thought to myself. Suddenly two giant-sized, shadowy humanoid silhouettes, covered in long, flowing, dark auburn hair, came into view, and I nearly passed out in astonishment. I was so shocked. I could not believe what I was seeing. I've never felt so much fear as I did in that moment. I could feel my heart thundering violently in my chest, not from the thrill of a burglary, but the sheer dread of being in close proximity to these awesome and terrifying-looking creatures. For indeed, whatever they were, without a shadow of a doubt, they were apex predators, for they were powerful, lofty, majestic, strong, and seriously intimidating. But what were they? I could not imagine. These gargantuan-sized, strapping creatures that were ripped with muscular definition stood on 2 feet and were easily over 8 foot tall. They looked human in their bodily shape and facial impressions, but they weren't fully human, and yet there were aspects to these creatures that reminded me of a great ape. They had such a solidness, brawniness, and stockiness to their powerful builds, rather like that of a rhino, only in human form, and they were easily 3 foot wide, and possibly weighed over 700 pounds, or even more. The creature's overlong arms hung below their knees, and the long tree-trunk-sized legs that were bent at the knees looked exceedingly powerful and very strong. The head was shaped like a dome that flowed into these colossal-sized shoulders very seamlessly, and I noted no apparent neck. I could discern that the hairless tan faces were long and the ears small, with a distinct, very wrinkled brow ridge, very flat pug-like nose with 2 open flares for nostrils, a long thin mouth, and very deep-set dark eyes. I watched in awe as the creatures continued to talk in this very peculiar language, backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. It went on and on and on. It seemed as if they were discussing something very intensely of great significance. I was hoping they'd walk away from us, but to my absolute horror, one of the critters sat down against the oak tree, where I'd previously been sitting only moments earlier. They continued to jabber away like a couple of gossiping housewives, and as they spoke their chatter became increasingly animated and very high-pitched as they became seemingly more excited about whatever it was that they were discussing. I almost wished that I could comprehend what they were saying, because it sounded fascinating. I noticed that the critters were both female, as they had hair-covered breasts, and it was very clear that they loved to talk. They were exceedingly garrulous. One of the critters kept scratching her head, almost as if in deep contemplation, as if she was thinking about something of great significance. I noticed that they were emotionally intelligent, discerning and reasoning, very much like human beings. One of the females let out a very shrill whistle, and then, as if on cue, a little humanoid figure came shimmering out of the tree and scuttling over to what I can only assume must be his mother. Then the other female also let out a shrill whistle, and then, like clockwork, another little creature came bounding out of the tree with the acrobatic prowess of orangutan and ran towards the other mother. I realised the upper tree branches were being used as a day nursery for the young ones that were about 2 feet in height and were obviously still very young. Both mothers continued to talk while they seemed to be ruffling their little ones' hair, looking for ticks in between the folds and partings of their heads. And when they found something, they would quite literally just pop it into their mouths, chew it, and eat it. One of the little ones was chattering away excitedly to its mother, pointing towards the tree where we were both hiding, and that was when I knew our cover was blown. Oh no, I thought. I was almost certain that Rebecca and I were living on borrowed time. Both mothers became very silent and sullen, looking at each other with bewildered expressions on their faces. And then they subsequently glided over to where we were hiding, and our cover was blown. In that moment I thought I was literally going to die, but to my amazement the creatures did not display any kind of aggression towards us, as their deep chestnut brown eyes seemed to study us with a curious interest, and for a moment our eyes locked in a long gaze. It was almost as if for a moment time stood very still, and as crazy as it sounds, I felt as if these strange creatures were looking right through me. The females exchanged a few words between each other, and I knew they were referring or talking about us. The creatures then patted their torsos, and the children responded immediately by climbing up their mothers like a tree, and then settling on their shoulders, and the anomalous ape-like humanoids, whatever they were, glided away into the woods with a seamless grace. "What the heck?" said Rebecca. "I've only gone and wet myself. I thought those monsters were going to eat us up for breakfast. I've never been so scared in all my life. Did you see the size of those things? I mean, they were gargantuan. They were enormous. What on earth were they?" "It looks like they're a cross between a human and an ape," I reflected. "Let's get out of here," said Rebecca, "or I'm going to have a heart attack." I could see she was physically shaking, because despite the fact that the creatures had not harmed us, it didn't make us any less terrified of what we had encountered, and the after effects of the encounter were causing us to tremble and wobble quite violently. "I'm shaking," I told Rebecca. "I can hardly stop myself. I thought those creatures were going to kill us. Look at my arms. They won't stop wobbling." Fast forward a couple of weeks, and luck turned against us, as during a robbery we failed to realise that there was actually someone still in the house, who woke up when he heard the floorboards creaking. At that time I was observing a beautiful vase, and whispered to Rebecca to come and look at what I'd found, because I thought it was an item of value. "I think it's worth a bob or two," I said excitedly. As Rebecca was studying the bottom of the vase, we were interrupted by a loud, booming voice. "What are you doing in my house?" I began to shake in terror and tried to make a hasty retreat, but the voice said, "Hold on, young lady. Not so fast, young lady. I've got a gun." To cut a long story short, this elderly man in a paisley dressing gown held us up at gunpoint, and then he called the police,
We begged him to let us go, but he was having none of that. When the police arrived, we were cuffed and taken to the station, and they were able to connect us with a series of other robberies in the area. I was completely devastated, as I'd never imagined things turning out like this. Our short-lived fun was most certainly over, and the idea of spending time in prison was the beginning of the most horrifying nightmare for me. I remember when the policeman was charging me, he looked at me in bewilderment. "Why would a young woman like you, who has so many privileges, throw their life away for a spate of robberies? I just don't get it. You have everything. Why would you do something like this?" "Because it was fun," I said, suddenly feeling pathetically stupid and very small. When my parents discovered what I'd done, they were totally appalled. "We didn't bring you up to be a thief," said my mother. "You've never wanted for anything in your entire life," she said. "I'm ashamed to call you my daughter. It's a disgrace what you've done, and you've embarrassed the entire family with all these shenanigans. In all my born days, I never believed I'd raise a burglar for a daughter." "I was bored," I protested. "Good grief, Ursula," said my mother. "Life's not just about having a good time, you know. You need to grow up, girl, and get real. Do you realise how many people you've hurt breaking into their homes like that? It's not just about the stealing, girl. It's about people feeling that their space has been invaded. It's about them not feeling safe anymore. Do you realise what you've done?" "I hadn't thought about that," I told my mother. "It would seem, Ursula, that you haven't engaged your brain at all. You haven't thought about anything, have you?" As for my husband, he didn't pack any punches. He asked me immediately for a divorce after he learnt what I'd done. "I don't know you, Ursula, anymore," he said. "What you have done has horrified me. I'm done with our relationship. I'm not going to wait until you come out of prison, that's for sure. I want a divorce now." To cut a long story short, I was sentenced to 4 years in jail, and Rebecca was sentenced to 6 because this was her second time to be convicted. When I met her, she'd only just completed a prison sentence, but she never shared this truth with me. Every day I spent in prison, eating the ghastly food and hanging around people that I would sooner rather avoid. Despite the fact that I was surrounded by so many people, I have never felt more alone in my entire life. I was missing out in so much, in raising my children, and my ex-husband was probably cavorting around the place and dating a beautiful woman by now, and I was all on my own. All these thoughts were like daggers to my heart, stabbing me violently with the pain of my dreadful loss. I had lost absolutely everything that I valued, because I'd wanted a moment of fun and excitement, but it was far too high a price to pay. When I finally came out of prison, it was hard to readapt and adjust to my new life, and for a short period of time, I actually moved back into my parents' home. But before long, my husband and I started to see each other again. I'm glad to say he forgave me completely for what I'd done. Fortunately, we rekindled the old flame and revived the spark, and finally got remarried. Yet I had missed out on so very much, especially 4 years of my children's lives, that I can never ever get back, just because of a selfish desire to have a great time. Looking back, I realise how foolish I was to travel down such a dark, insidious road, and I'm dreadfully sorry to anyone who was on the receiving end of my thieving escapades, and anyone whose home I broke in and violated because I made them feel unsafe. I learnt one lesson in life, and that was that every day is incredibly precious, and don't throw it away for a moment of fun. It's really not worth the hefty cost. You'll ultimately have to pay, and this could be anything like drugs, alcohol, infidelity, and so much more. Let me tell you from experience, it's just not worth it, and that's the message I'd like to convey in this forum of yours. All these years later, I now know that the creatures we saw in the woods were indeed Bigfoots. I do remember that they weren't aggressive in any way towards us, but even thinking about them now brings me out in a cold sweat, because based on appearances, they were terribly frightening. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.